Future is Local is the first report of the Mission Zero coalition. Some of you may remember that at the time of the government response to net zero, I stated that I intended to form a new coalition specifically to advance in greater policy detail the 10-year missions that were set out in the Mission Zero report. Now, although the Net Zero Review had attempted to summarise in as much detail how the UK could deliver more effectively on its net zero pathways, I was keen to continue this work and set out in a more thought-through narrative why the missions the review had chosen were so important. And I think it was also an opportunity to ensure that ahead of the oncoming next general election, work could continue to stress to all political parties, and I do stress that the review is completely cross-party, the need for further policy reform and innovation in order not just to deliver net zero by 2050, but critically, and I think we've seen this in the last week's sort of government statements around the sort of confusion between net zero and 2050 and the need for emissions reduction for 2030 to deliver our national determined contribution target of 68% emissions reduction. So far, we've established 3 Mission Zero networks. There's this local Mission Zero network, an industrial Mission Zero network, looks in depth at industrial decarbonisation. The Buildings Mission Zero network, which focuses on decarbonising our buildings, both past, present and future, and whose first report, Mission Retrofit, will also be published this week on Thursday, the 28th of September. And I'm sure that the link for that will be posted into the chat box shortly. But today's report, The Future is Local, and a link to that will appear also in the chat box, follows the culmination of several months of meetings, including 5 evidence roundtables of the local Mission Zero network. And I'm very grateful to the Energy Systems Catapult, Grosvenor, Lloyds Banking Group, Phoenix, Pollution Solution, Reckitt, SSE, Suez, My Society, Community Energy England, the Mayor of Bristol, the Mayor of London, the West Midlands Combined Authority, UK 100, the LGA and 3CI, for all participating and hosting roundtable events as the network gathered evidence for its report. I'm also grateful to my co-chair, the Tees Valley Mayor, Lord Ben Houchen, who's going to speak at this launch today. So today's report is entitled The Future is Local. And I remember, I think, using that phrase when I was Energy Minister back in 2019. But I could hardly have imagined that sort of 4 years on, when I toured the country going around as part of the engagement process in Net Zero Review, I'd see for myself so many great examples of local delivery taking place. In the Net Zero Review, taking a place-based approach to policy delivery was a theme, a golden thread, as it were, that ran all the way through the entire report. There is clearly a role for national coordination and direction setting on net zero, the report stated. But to achieve a place-based, place-sensitive, locally led transition to net zero, government must place its trust in local leaders and communities to deliver. If it does this, then government can galvanise the ambition of communities to ensure that every corner of the country feels the economic and social benefits of action on climate change. And the review was clear that at present, that degree of trust and confidence in placing net zero powers in the hands of regional and local government was lacking. Often, local leaders are better placed to engage with communities and businesses on net zero, the report stated, better placed to engage and understand the challenges and opportunities their areas face in transitioning to net zero, and better placed to deliver locally tailored net zero interventions. However, they currently face a lack of clarity over their role, a disjointed and short-term approach to funding, and require further support to build capacity and capability needed locally to deliver successful transition. Now, the government response to the review broadly welcomes the Net Zero Review's conclusions and recommendations on local net zero action, though it rejected calls for a statutory duty on local authorities and wouldn't be drawn into discussions about future net zero financing models that I'm hoping will come forward at the Chancellor's autumn statement on the 22nd of November. At the same time as the government response, we've seen a continued assertion that local net zero delivery should be prioritised. So we've seen UK 100 publish their Powers in Place report, highlighting the opportunity not only for where local authorities can use existing legal and regulatory powers for delivery of net zero policy locally, but also calling for reforms to funding and finance and planning. The CCC's progress report, published in June 2023, again sets out key areas where the government needs to provide greater certainty and clarity for local authorities. The CCC set out that they require the government to set out a clear process and governance framework for delivering credible, coordinated energy planning across local, regional, and national levels. And today's report, I hope, continues to build momentum towards the understanding that net zero simply is too important to be left in the hands of central government politicians. I think if the events of last week has demonstrated anything, that we need to try to depoliticize net zero by providing those powers, entrenching them in at a local level to ensure that they're properly embedded for the future, to de-risk them from any changes in central government policy. It's also too costly not to prioritise local action. UKRI's Accelerating Net Zero Delivery report found that a place-specific approach delivers more benefit for less cost. So comparing what's called a place-agnostic approach with a place-specific approach, their report found that to achieve the sixth carbon budget, it would require £195 billion of investment if you didn't consider place at all. And that in turn would release £57 billion of energy savings. A place-specific approach tailored to local and regional authorities, however, would only require £58 billion of investment, and yet has the potential to release £108 billion of energy savings for consumers. And that's not even going into some of the wider GVA health benefit related questions that sort of drive that saving up a lot further. Now, today's report is structured into four parts. After an introduction that sets out fully the policy landscape since the net zero review, part one of the report starts by focusing not on the challenges, but on the positive opportunities that greater local net zero delivery can bring. Now, this is a narrative I took forward in the net zero review, and one that I'm hoping the Mission Zero Network Coalition continue to weave. In particular, local net zero delivery focuses on the benefits of how a locally focused transition can pay dividends. So that covers four areas in the report. First is greater economic growth and strengthening local economies. The second is delivering net zero at lower cost and more efficiently. The third is creating cheaper and more secure energy, dealing with that question of how do you create greater energy security through local delivery. And fourthly, driving forward and enhancing public engagement and support. And we draw on examples from across the country, not least in the north of England and the West Midlands, where regional net zero strategies have set out very clearly the economic value net zero can bring. And I know Ben Houchen will be speaking to that in a moment. Part one also highlights that when it comes to a local delivery of net zero, we're also in a global race of sorts with other countries such as France, the EU more widely having set up 100 net zero cities project, and also the US prioritizing specific locally led net zero delivery. The report then sets out in part two the current sort of landscape of what's happening at the moment on the ground, how local authorities are currently or currently not delivering net zero, and how the government has structured the relationship between central and local government on net zero following the net zero strategy. Now, I hope this provides a useful digest of the situation at present, as well as highlighting its limitations for local government. At the same time, part two attempts to identify areas of growing best practice, such as local area energy plans, and also the Bristol City LEAP initiative, as well as wider public engagement programs such as OES Zero in Hull. I'm sure we'll get on to discussing these implementation frameworks later, and the wider deployment of these as pioneering examples of best practice in some forms of the recommendation of the report. Part 3 of the report then turns to the thematic challenges that local and regional authorities are facing. Now, these have been identified previously as a lack of clarity in the relationship between central and local government over the net zero roles, a funding landscape that's currently too complex and too short term, and a planning system that's not fit for a net zero purpose. Now, to help solve these broad thematic challenges, the report makes 32 overall recommendations, which have been grouped into 5 overarching themes and key recommendations. So, to help tackle the challenge of a lack of coordination, the report calls on government to develop a local net zero delivery framework to enable collaboration between the UK government and local and regional authorities using the local net zero forum. Now, obviously the question around the roles and responsibilities of this net zero forum have been raised elsewhere, not least the CCC. But the report sets out how the forum should develop its roles and responsibilities to prioritise co-developing this framework that's going to set out an agreed view of the key roles between central and local government, as well as the mechanisms to coordinate the delivery of these. The local net zero forum, which at the moment its membership is slightly opaque, should have greater transparency, accountability. It should have representatives from every region of England and every devolved nation, so that it can be truly as effective as a representative of the whole of the United Kingdom. It should also have representatives from each of the net zero hubs. Indeed, the chief executives of each hub should be an automatic member of the forum. And the local net zero forum should develop a strategy plan that sets out delivery milestones in this plan, so it can be an effective decision-making body rather than just run the risk of being a talking shop. Now, local government should also hasten the adoption and consistency and success of local area energy plans across the UK. And overwhelmingly, the report recommends that this could become the new normal when it comes to local net zero delivery. The government has yet to formally endorse or provide support for a formal definition of local area energy plans. And this should be an immediate priority, with the potential for linking the commitment to a formal adoption of a local area energy plan to future local net zero funding. And given the low costs involved for local authorities to commission and produce a local area energy plan, the government, we've said, should guarantee funding for every local authority to develop their own LAEP, which should be, I think, about in the region of about £40 million, but actually delivers enormous benefits, as the Energy Systems Catapult most recent report has demonstrated. The government should also ensure that a local area energy plan governance framework ensures that local authorities have a duty to collaborate on net zero, so everyone's not in their own silo doing their own separate thing, and are supported to have consistent data inputs across the UK to ensure that all plans are comparable, interoperable, and easier to refresh and update. A big challenge, I think, in local net zero delivery is we have this sort of tessellated approach. Every local authority set its own local net zero benchmarks. How do we ensure that these can work in synergy together? The local net zero hubs, along with the Energy Systems Catapult, should also be closely involved with the development of these plans, and government must ensure this is a condition, as I said, of potential future funding. It's also vital when it comes to funding, the government simplifies and enhances net zero funding to support local and regional authorities with long-term certainty, while also enabling effective public-private partnerships that can unlock inward investment. So the report calls on the Chancellor at the spending review in November 2023 to actually announce the establishment of new net zero city leaps using the Bristol City Leap template and the work of 3CI and the Green Finance Institute to scale this model of effective public-private partnership to other cities and regions across the country, with the necessary finance to subsequently unlock inward private investment. The Bristol City Leap, I think, was a £7.5 million project, public funding, but has crowded in £424 million of private investment so far. The next spending review, the Chancellor should also seek to establish a consolidated local net zero fund that's aligned with other long-term funds in order to provide local authorities with greater certainty. The report highlights, I think we've got sort of 8 different pots of funding for retrofit, maybe 13 pots of funding local authorities can apply for. Each of them are disaligned and mean that local authorities are often spending too much money bidding for short-term pots of funding, of which there's no guarantee of continuity in the next round. The local net zero fund should be both long-term and agile and coordinate across departments critically and be non-competitive, while at the same time ensuring that local authorities have a greater lead-in times to apply for this funding and a longer timescale at which to deliver outcomes. At the moment, local authorities are jumping through hoops. We heard time and time again that it's just not a stable funding environment, and even certain funds, by the time it comes to a next funding round, the rules of the game have changed, and local authorities find themselves unable to be eligible for that funding. When it comes to eligibility, the local net zero fund should have an eligibility threshold of local areas committing to a local area energy plan in order to make sure that funding is spent the best and most efficient way. And in order for these new models of blending and blended public and private investment to succeed, we've also set out the UK Investment Bank should be allowed to lift the artificial £5 million cap on investable net zero projects, which at the moment is making the ability for community energy projects to bid into this impossible. When it comes to planning, as I said, the planning system simply is not fit for a net zero purpose. The report calls on government to commence an urgent review this year of the national planning policy framework to ensure that the NPPF is better aligned to the scale and urgency of net zero, nature recovery and adaptation challenges. And if local and regional authorities have certainty and clarity to deliver their net zero plans, they've got to have confidence that the NPPF will help and not hinder these. A net zero test we've called for should be introduced in all planning decisions, while the NPPF and future planning policy should commit to ensuring there is an effective carbon emissions assessment based on a whole life cycle carbon analysis in order to target effectively emissions reductions. And the UK government needs to give practical guidance and establish a framework on future community benefit with a clear plan for how this can be implemented in the planning system. The recent amendment in the energy bill simply doesn't go far enough in demonstrating how community benefit should work in the long term. And the government should then ensure that a community benefit system can be effectively regulated for in the anticipation of the delivery of future onshore renewable projects and a net zero national grid. And actually, the Local Mission Zero Network intends to convene and publish a further report on developing effective ways to support and empower local communities through community consent, alongside scaling up locally focused energy projects such as Project Leo across the country. So the intention of this report, this network, was not just to produce one report, was to continue this work going forwards. And finally, in conclusion, a new enhanced partnership in the form of a charter, a local net zero charter, between the UK government, devolved governments and regional and city local authorities is needed to accelerate the transition to net zero and to drive the economic prosperity I've spoken about. The government should ensure that as part of this, all new devolutions have net zero clauses within them by default, and powers additionally to devolve net zero funding and powers are contained within them. The government should also seek to ensure that the pilots that are currently underway in the Greater Manchester Combined Authority and the West Midlands Combined Authority, which give them powers over sort of retrofit and planning net zero projects, should be replicated swiftly to ensure that net zero funding can be devolved in all permissible circumstances. And in order to show greater public engagement to prevent one region being favoured over another, the government should seek to ensure not that there's just one trailblazer net zero project in just England, but also in each region of England and each devolved nation. Net zero policy, finally, needs to be given greater support in local authorities. We can set the frameworks, we can set the regulation, the legislation and the planning, but this is also about capacity and capability. So ensuring that local authorities are given that greater support in order to build out their capability, with a requirement that an official at director level should be given a dedicated net zero responsibilities. There should also be a cabinet member for net zero in local authorities. And in order to help achieve greater consistency and enhance capability, a local net zero data and reporting framework should be established in order to provide, as I said, that consistency and to increase ultimately integrity for reporting across local authorities. And the Net Zero Review recommended that the ONS should collect more forms of net zero related data. And this network maintains that net zero will be better delivered the more we know and where we know action needs to take place. So the report has now sort of been published. Hopefully it will be online or online very shortly. Apologies for the length again. I mean, it's about 35,000 words, about sort of 60 pages. So it goes into more detail compared to the 5 or so pages that the Net Zero Review could give on looking at devolving and providing greater support for local authorities to deliver net zero. But hopefully you will find it both a useful guide to the current situation, as well as making sort of recommendations for the future that I hope, if not this government and this administration, if they don't adopt it, I'm hoping that a future administration will take this very seriously, whatever happens at the next general election. Thanks very much. I'm now going to hand over to Lord Ben Houchen, Mayor of the Tees Valley Combined Authority, to set out his vision for how we can deliver net zero more effectively, both locally and regionally. Ben.
Thanks very much, Chris. Just wanted to say, first of all, before we get started, thank you for all of the work that you've done. I think while I am a co-author of this report, I'm very proud of the work that we've done together with many people on this call. I think it's fair to say that none of this would have been started and we wouldn't have been able to get such a fantastic group of people together if it wasn't for your leadership. So thank you for all that you've done, and I'm hoping that this will be well received. I've seen already in one of the comments, will the government listen? Well, we hope so, don't we? And the report's published today, and I'd encourage everybody to take their time to read it and share it with colleagues, local councillors, MPs and others to make the case that this is something that the government should take up. And I'm not going to speak for as long as Chris, but I just want to reinforce a couple of points that are very close to my heart in the report, which is we've seen, obviously, in the last week or so, it becomes particularly pertinent as to the goal for net zero and the plans to decarbonise our economy. We've seen the announcement from the Prime Minister not moving away from our net zero target, but changing the means with which we get there and the timescales with which we get there. And for me, it just reinforces the point that local is always better. You know, being able to take decisions, having the power and having the money closer to the people that elect our representatives always leads to better outcomes. And we've seen that in my region as well. So it's a key part of this report, as Chris has quite nicely set out, that actually trying to push the government for the mechanisms for what we're trying to achieve rather than dictate what specifically we are trying to achieve is extremely important. Because as I've said in the formation of this report with lots of people, what's right for my region as the second largest carbon emitting region in the country with the huge chemical and processing industry is a different net zero challenge with different requirements to reach net zero on a regional level than other parts of the country. And so by being local, we can design locally deliverable and appropriate net zero plans. And so I really hope that these recommendations are taken up, because if you look at what we're doing in Teesside, as I say, second largest carbon emitting region in the country, we have to tackle major issues with carbon emitters in the chemical and processing industry. But we also have to be cognizant of the fact that more than 5,500 people are directly employed in those industries. And there are certainly more than 10,000 jobs that are linked to those industries that exist today. And so what we're trying to do is develop a plan, and we have now developed our decarbonisation plan that is public and is available for all to see. And that has been co-authored by industry itself, where we've been able to use the powers and the money we have through devolution to try and cajole and push businesses and investors to take account of their net zero requirements, and also to get them to share their expertise and how they can get there as quickly as possible. Because we have to be cognizant, particularly in the chemical and processing industry, there are lots of very key products that they make that we need to survive. And we need to make sure that people can access, but we need to do it in an environmentally friendly way. And so looking at things in Teesside like carbon and capture and storage, which will be the world's first industrial scale carbon capture and storage facility, producing almost 1 gigawatt of clean decarbonised power, which will decarbonise the power for about 1.3 million homes in the UK, about 5% of the UK's requirement. We are leading the way and pushing government to set its strategy on things like the hydrogen village trials, of which Redcar in Teesside is the only area now being considered for 2,000 homes to be converted 100% onto hydrogen, and using that as a test pilot for how we could, in theory, use hydrogen in the home, particularly in industrial clusters where it's more appropriate compared to other parts of the country where distributed networks might be able to help achieve that as a solution. And just recently, we've been announced as home to one of the first, probably the first actually, sustainable aviation fuel plant that we built in the UK. For anybody that has followed anything that I've done over the last 7 years, aviation and airports are quite important to me. And I often get asked the question how I can marry my support for aviation with the net zero agenda. And I'm a big believer that locally developed strategies, coming up with new ideas and technology and development can allow people to continue to use these types of technologies, continue to enjoy flying, but allow for a decarbonisation plan for industry as well. So I think there's a huge amount to take from this. As Chris has rightly said, it is a long report, but I think it's needed because rather than a brief report which helps set the scene, if we want government and others to take this up with vigour and really develop decarbonisation plans, it's important that there is a framework and a level of detail there. And again, once again, thank you to Chris and everybody who's contributed, because I think this could really set the framework for how local government and local regions can help really take up the reins and inform government policy and actually overtake where government policy is by taking up the reins and delivering our net zero targets by 2030 and ultimately 2050. So thanks again, Chris. And I really enjoyed the report, and well done for all the work that you've done, and also the team behind you at the Mission Zero Coalition.